Welcome, everybody. My name is Holly, and I am the new Community Engagement Coordinator here at Lumina. For those who have joined us on other Illuminating series, you've had the pleasure of seeing Brooke host these presentations. This is her last Illuminating presentation as she transitions out of Lumina. So give her some applause and some well wishes in the chat. And we are going to start off today's presentation with a poll question. So go ahead and submit your answers. Okay, looks like we've got almost everyone's vote in. Okay, so about 67% have heard the term home funeral before. Okay, so now we are going to ask you to answer another question, but in the chat this time. We'll give you a little time here. So the question is, what are 3 words you associate with the term home funeral? So I will add that to the chat for you all. And just go ahead and take your time putting the answers in there. And now, while you put your answers in the chat, I would like to introduce today's topic. So today, we will be hearing from hearing about family-directed funeral options, rights, and resources with our presenters, Holly Pruitt and Kelia Carver. The Illuminating series, for those who are joining us maybe for the first time today, it's a monthly seminar that Lumina puts on every 3rd Tuesday of the month. And we have experts on various life topics, such as healthy aging, advanced care planning, caregiving, and other end-of-life experiences. So for today's presentation, go ahead and direct any questions, comments that you might have in the chat feature, and we'll keep track of those for you throughout the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end to go over the questions. And also, the PowerPoint presentation that you'll see today will be available afterwards, as well as a recording of the presentation itself. So if there's folks that signed up that weren't able to make it today, folks that you might know, just you can reassure them that they'll be able to see the presentation. And a little background about our presenters today. Kelia Carver and Holly Pruitt are co-creators of the non-commercial public information website, Oregon Funeral Resources and Education. Kelia is a bereaved mother, home funeral advocate, and cattle and wheat rancher. And Holly is a funeral celebrant, home funeral guide, and community death educator. So before I turn it over to Holly and Kelia, we have one more poll question for you. And I see all your answers have come in the chat. Thank you very much for those. Okay. So this poll question is to just describe who you are, what your role is as far as this presentation goes. And if you have more than one, feel free to check all that apply. Okay, votes are still coming in. Looks like we've almost got everybody. We'll give it another second here. Okay, looks like we can end that. So almost half are associating themselves as community members. And then it looks like next would be caregivers at about 30%, hospice staff, educators. Looks like we have a pretty even poll here. Okay. Thank you all for participating. So now we are going to turn it over to our presenters and let them get started.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you, Brooke, for all your advanced work in setting this up, and to all of Lumina for just the incredibly important work that you do in the community and hosting all of these conversations. I want to say hello and thank you to folks who have dialed in from so many different places. It's really cool to see the mix of attendees. Keely and I were curious who would be in the room, and to see that about a third of you that were on for the first poll are unfamiliar with the term home funeral. It's not the most obvious term, and so we hope to open that up for you today. But I'm not surprised that quite a few of you are familiar, since many of you I know are colleagues, even in other parts of the country. So we really appreciate the whole breadth of experience that's in this room, from the grassroots level and from helping professionals. It's been really neat to see the range of words that have showed up in the chat that describe what you might associate with a home funeral. And it means different things to different people. For myself, I really wanted to start to open up, our imagination at the community level around how we think about caring for each other in times of death. And that process got a major boost about 2 years ago when I got an email that read, "My name is Kelia Carver, and I'm a bereaved mother." And that email started the process that led to this website, Oregon Funeral Resources and Education, that contains all the information we're going to share with you today. And it is designed to be Oregon specific. This is hosted by the Hospice Agency in Corvallis, Oregon, but is broadly applicable with specific variations to other states. So if you are dialing in out of Oregon and you're curious, I hope you'll do the research to find out the specifics that apply to you. I know our time is going to fly by way too fast. And so Kelia and I encourage you, if we don't get a chance to touch on the piece of the topic that is of most interest to you or to answer your specific question, to use the contact form. You can see the tab displayed on OregonFuneral.org, and we will follow up with you. Kelia is going to tell you a bit more about her story as we get into our presentation, Family-Directed Funeral Options, Rights, and Resources. Kelia?
So I just wanted to say thank you to Lumina for hosting. I was a student at OSU, and it feels really special to be talking on to something based out of Corvallis. So we created this website. It wasn't just Holly and I, it was a whole team, and we were very lucky. Holly has been doing this for a number of years, and she has a great breadth of knowledge, but we also had Lee Webster, who has been involved in just about everything that you can be involved with that has to do with end of life and caring for your own dead, green burial. She was part of the creation of the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is the national organization that I used to reach out and find Holly's name. And then the site, for me, was very importantly vetted by Judith Moman, who is a practicing attorney licensed with the Oregon State Bar, because one of the critical things is making sure that the legal information is accurate and easy to understand, because this is a right. And from my point of view, I mean, there's so many different ways you can come at it, but it is important to me that people know their rights, what is possible for them, regardless of the choices that they make. You know, once you know what is possible, then you can choose what is best for you. Next slide. The site was, I'm lagging. The site was also reviewed by medical experts and funeral directors. Most significantly, we had Dr. Sean Hurst, the Oregon's acting chief medical examiner, vet the site because we wanted it to be completely non-commercial and above reproach. We wanted everyone from law enforcement to hospital chaplains to nurses to doctors to police officers to feel comfortable recommending this as a resource. And working with Dr. Hurst, I think that we succeeded in that. There's nothing for sale here. It's simply information to help families make choices and do what is best for them. Next slide. So what do we mean by a home funeral? It's a non-commercial family-centered response to death that involves the family and its social community in the care and preparation of the deceased for disposition. But it may occur in your home, or it may not occur in your home. And your level of involvement is up to you. Some people need help with transportation because they don't have a big enough vehicle, so they hire out that part. Some people need help with heavy lifting because they have bad backs. They hire out that part. Some people, the important part for them is caring for the body, and the disposition options are not as important. So they do the body care, and then they get somebody else to deal with the rest of it. You have the ability to make your choice about what is best for your family. You can emphasize minimal, non-invasive preparation of the body if that's important for you. You can rely on your family's own social networks. You can rely on your friends, on your extended family, on your faith community to help you make these arrangements if that is what you want. You can use no commercial funeral providers, or you can use them in a way that seems best to you. There's no rules. There's no funeral police, as our friend Lee says. You make the choices that are right for your family. Next slide. So why does this matter? It's going to matter differently for every family. Your values is going to determine why this is important to you. For some people, maybe it's cost. Funerals can be very, very expensive. For some people, they're trying to reduce their carbon footprint even upon their death. Hardwood coffins from overseas, concrete grave liners, embalming, all of those things are unnecessary unless you find them to be of personal value. And so if your values don't align with that, you don't need to use them. There's various faith communities that have timelines or specific requirements for some of their people caring for the dead, or they need to be done in the temple. You know, all of that is not necessarily compatible with a commercial funeral provider, and those people can feel more comfortable doing it themselves. It could be about relationship. You know, this is a body of a person that you loved. And it's their most precious possession. So maybe it's important to you because it's your mother, or it's your child, or it's your sibling, or it's your grandparent, and you don't want to give away the privilege. It could be about maintaining control. You don't want to let go of that control because you need things done in a certain way and for it to be right. Maybe your family has a tendency towards DIY, and you just like to do things yourself. Every person's reason will be different. And I want to take a moment, next slide, to talk about why this is important to me. My son, Max, died in 2018. He died suddenly. He drowned in the farm pond. The babysitter didn't watch him. And he was transported to St. Charles in Bend, where he was declared dead. And at that time, I was like, okay, well, we'll take him home. If he's dead, nothing in this hospital can help him. There's no emergency. We don't need these people anymore. There's just us and our son. And I was told by the chaplain, by the medical examiner that we were dealing with, because every child's death in the state of Oregon is investigated as a possible crime, which I believe is right, that it was not possible for me to take my son home, and that they never said, but they implied by handing me a sheet of funeral homes in the Bend area that we were required to hire a funeral home. And that was just devastating. We couldn't leave Bend and come home that night. I had a 2-year-old who survived his brother, and we couldn't come home and get him because I couldn't handle the idea of leaving my 4.5-year-old with strangers in another town. And so we stayed in a hotel, and it was just awful. But somewhere in the middle of the night, I turned to my husband and I was like, I mean, it's our son, it's his body. Like, we hugged it, we kissed it, we bathed it, I carried it in my womb, I delivered him, I breastfed him. Nobody else has more rights to this body that we love than we do. And there's a limited time. Once somebody is dead, then decomposition is eventually going to happen. Bodies don't last forever. And there's no one else who should have the privilege of dressing him one last time, of touching his skin, of touching his hair, of looking at the 3 freckles on his back. Nobody else deserves that. We are his parents. We are the people who love him most, and certainly no stranger. And I do have to stress that the funeral director was like, he was a nice guy and he tried really hard to be helpful, but it was not his son. And so I had the presence of mind to say to my husband when he called the funeral director, I said, you tell him they pick up Max from the hospital, they take him to the funeral home and store him, and they do absolutely nothing. Like, they don't touch him, nothing. And our funeral director was very respectful of that. And we took the clothes down in a suitcase and we dressed him and we put him in the casket and we hauled him back to the ranch on the back of the flatbed pickup and buried him in our ranch cemetery by my husband's mother. So he's real close to his grandma, because he was just a little guy, you know, he was just a little guy. And so when I found out that that was not true, that you don't have to hire a funeral director, that I could have brought my son's body home and he could have spent the 3 days while we were trying to make arrangements and figure it out before we buried him in our house with his parents, with his brother. I was devastated and angry, but not so much angry, it's just too bad because you can't get the time back. Those last 3 days that his body was above ground, they never come back. And so it's important to me to tell other people about this option, because maybe it's important to you, but maybe it's not important to you personally, but it's important to your sibling or your parent or your friend. And you can be the person who says, oh yes, I've heard of that. We can do that. I know a website. I can help you figure it out, because you don't get the time back. You don't get the time back. All right, next slide. So where are we? So the goal of our website is to make all this information easy to find and easy to understand. So we have a lot of sections in the website. So if you have a question about transportation, there's a section for it. If you have a question about paperwork, there's a section for it. There's a great glossary if you're shopping and you can't understand what somebody's trying to sell you. You know, what that kind of casket is, or the differences between kinds of cemeteries, so that you can look up what regulations apply to what. It's all on the website, and we want it to be there so that when people are in distress, they can read it and they can make good decisions for themselves. Next slide. For me, the most important part of the website is the part that talks about the Oregon law. We call it Learn the Law, because that really determines what must be done and everything else is optional. So let's go to the next slide. Oregon law provides for families who choose to retain custody and control of the body of a loved one or care for their own dead. And when you care for your own dead, whether you file the paperwork, whether you do the transportation, whether you're doing body care, you are considered in the law a person acting as a funeral service practitioner. And anyone can do this. You can do it for yourself, for your mother, for your own relatives, but you can also go help your friend. And as long as no money changes hands, as long as no one is paid, it is completely permitted, which makes sense because it's just neighbors helping neighbors, right? As it's not a commercial transaction, it's somebody giving of their heart to somebody that they care about. Oregon law also allows for choices regarding the self-determination of disposition. If that's important to somebody, then they can fill out and file the paperwork to record their disposition wishes ahead of time. And that's fairly simple to do. It's just a page, but it has to be done. So if people don't think that their next of kin are going to agree with them, that might be important for them. It provides a way for the family to file the necessary legal paperwork. And it provides a way families are completely allowed to contract and make arrangements for the services and disposition themselves. You do not need somebody to contact the cemetery, to contact the crematorium for you. You, under the law, are allowed to make those arrangements yourself in Oregon. Next slide. Oregon law does not restrict families from caring for their own dead. There is no restriction on the time that families may spend with the deceased before disposition. There is no number of days ever mentioned in the law. Sometimes in hospice, there's something referred to as the 24-hour rule, which probably stems from some private hospices policies. And certainly hospices are businesses that may make their own policies. But when you are in your own home, there's no regulation. There's no number of days. It is you doing what is right for your family. It does not prohibit families from transporting the deceased home or to disposition. This is significant in my neck of the woods where the mileage charges rack up real quick when you have to drive an hour and a half to get to the cemetery. It does not require the use of embalming. That I've heard is a common upsell from funeral service providers. It is not required under Oregon law. It does not require the use of a vault. A cemetery may have a policy that requires you to use a vault or a grave liner, but that is not Oregon law. That is a private cemetery policy. And it does not prohibit burial at home if the county approval is obtained. Now, this might be tricky if you're living in town on a small lot, but if you're living somewhat rurally and you have land and that's of interest, then you would need to do the work through the county planning department to figure out how to make that happen. Next slide. So the website has a lot of nitty-gritties on the how-tos of how to go about doing this. And there's tips and tricks from ladies who have been doing this for many, many years that can be very helpful. But first, I want to think through what it is that you need to know in order to do this for yourself, for your friends, for your family. And if you could use the raise hand button, or if you could just raise your hand, even if you don't have the video on in your own room. Let's think about the skills that you would need to be able to do this all yourself. So, have you changed diapers on a baby or an adult or somebody in between? Have you helped someone bathe and dress? Have you helped somebody do their hair or their makeup for a fancy occasion so that they look just right? Can you drive something a little bigger, like a minivan or a pickup truck or an SUV? Can you lift heavy things, or if you're at the point in your life where you can't lift heavy things anymore, do you have some people in your Rolodex that you would call to lift heavy things to help you out? Do you have some carpentry or sewing skills or other craft skills? People do make their own caskets, they make their own shrouds if that's of interest. Now the next one can seem intimidating, filing paperwork, but have you filled out government paperwork? Maybe you applied for a driver's license or filed taxes or had to fill out Social Security or Medicare forms. Have you had to be incredibly polite and persistent on the phone? Perhaps you deal with health insurance and have to get through to them, or have to deal with the Social Security office. Have you done any of that? Have you organized a party or a reunion or a big dinner where you had to have people show up at a certain time and make sure there was enough seating and think about the parking a little bit? That is the list of skills that we are hiring a funeral director to do if we hire a funeral director. And I bet for most of you, and I saw with the hands raised, most of you have done all of that, or 85% of it, and you have friends that can do the rest. So, next slide.
Celia, your audio just cut out. Looks like you're on, but I'm not hearing you. I'll pick it up because I'm not hearing your audio. Okay. So I think Celia is just about to conclude with demonstrating that this is a continuum, was the last thing I heard her say, that under Oregon law and under the law in almost every state, there are just a few exceptions. You can purchase only what you want or need. You can use a funeral home to do everything that is commonly done. You can do what we've just described as a home funeral with family, wider community, or what may be becoming most common, a blended funeral, where you retain control and purchase what is beneficial or necessary only. Next slide, please. You'll see one of the handouts on the website is a continuum in these major areas of body care, death certificate, transportation, and disposition that just illustrates the kind of continuum. Body care, for example, at the far end, the funeral home may handle all aspects of body care and preparation, but the family can also go to a funeral home facility and actually handle that themselves. But in the funeral home building, the family might do body care at a hospital or care facility. It can be as simple as being handed a washcloth, or that can be done at home. And so with every aspect of the care, you can see here some examples that just illustrate different options in terms of blending those responsibilities. Next slide, please. So to conclude, and Celia, thank you for that amazing overview, but it really does boil down to just two things that must happen in Oregon, which is filing the registration of death, which is the death certificate, and ensuring legal disposition of the body and transportation to disposition. So just a few more details on that with the next slide. This is a photo of the paperwork packet that is available for families that do want to handle the legal paperwork related to death. It is obtained from the Portland office building of the state health authority, the Vital Stats office. They will mail it to those who request it when a death is anticipated in advance. They somewhat, there's a little bit of a misnomer. They call it a home burial packet, but it contains everything that's needed regardless of whether a burial happens at home or whether a body is cremated. So it really would more accurately be called a home funeral packet. And it contains the live death certificate, meaning the actual physical piece of paper that is filed through the county registrar's office. That paper, which is on the right there, along with the body tag, the burial tag that accompanies the body, is a triplicate form. And once it is signed by the medical certifier of death, which is either the physician of record or the hospice, if enrolled in hospice, or the coroner in the case where there's an investigation or an accidental or unanticipated death. Once that medical certifier signs this top copy, the second copy underneath becomes the transportation permit, and the last piece is the final disposition permit. And so that, along with the burial tag, is all of the information there. We go to the next slide. You can see this is another handout that can be downloaded from the website. It specifies the step-by-step timeline of what pieces of paper need to be filed when and with whom in the state of Oregon. And that is also on a handout from the state in the packet, but this visual presentation kind of breaks it down a little bit further. And if we go to the next slide, you can see there's also close-up of the forms on the website. We can include a link to a death certificate worksheet that is provided by the state of Oregon, where you can download the PDF, because the rest of this packet really can't be obtained unless, for example, you're in a hospice timeframe of an anticipated death within 6 months, because these are documents that actually have records numbers attached to them. But the death certificate worksheet is simply a generic PDF that you can download, print off, and fill out all the information that would need to go onto a record of death, a death certificate at that time, so that you have that in advance. Let's go to the next slide, please, and just briefly touch on the final disposition options that are legal in Oregon. And as Kelia mentioned, we have a glossary of terms, and we also have how to handle final disposition with great detail about all of these different options. So what's most common in Oregon is cremation. The conventional flame-based cremation is generally the most economical form, unless you're able to bury on your own property. And it has some upsides. It has the downside of using a lot of fossil fuel, and also emitting possibly mercury and some other toxins into the environment, which is why there's increasing interest in water-based cremation, sometimes called aquamation, aquacremation. The legal term is alkaline hydrolysis, and Oregon is one of, I think it's about 20 states now in which this is legal. It's been used in medical facilities for a long time. And you can arrange for a flame-based cremation directly, even just via the internet with cremation providers. Aqua cremation does need to be arranged through a funeral home because there are very few facilities in the state. Almost all funeral homes contract with a behind-the-scenes provider in in Portland, that does almost all of the aqua cremation, although there is a funeral home in Roseburg, Oregon, that actually was the first facility to offer it. In both cases, the flesh of the body is very quickly reduced in a matter of just a couple of hours, and bone fragments remain, and those are ground down to create what's often called ashes, or the cremated remains. And of course, there are many options then for what you can choose to do those. You can contract with a cemetery to legally bury the cremated remains. You can scatter them in public places. It's kind of don't ask, don't tell, or on private property. You can inter them in a cemetery, mausoleum, or niche, or make them into any manner of memorial product as well. And there are a lot of examples of stories of different ways that people honor those cremated remains. Whole body burial refers to the whole body going into either mausoleum, niche, or into the ground. And the conventional form maybe in recent years, an embalmed body that is in a casket that then goes into a cement or metal grave liner or burial vault, if that is required by cemeteries, largely to prevent the caving in as the body eventually decomposes. And as Kelia mentioned, those are not required products under state law, but particular cemeteries may require them. A natural burial refers to an unembalmed body that is contained in a biodegradable shroud, if desired, or casket that could be made from renewable materials such as pine wood or bamboo or seagrass. And there are a variety of options in Oregon for a natural burial. There are new ones developing all the time. And I recommend that you go to the Green Burial Council site to see who has opted into the listing there, or Google or ask around. There are conservation burial grounds where the entire ecosystem is dedicated to this cycle of renewal. And there is only natural burial happening there. There are conventional cemeteries that have set aside a part of their cemetery for natural burial, and others that allow natural burial side by side with conventional burial. So you'll want to research, if this appeals to you, what is available locally and the new options that may be coming online. Our website provides detail as well about military veteran burial, home burial, which I know some people are curious about. As Kelia said, you need to get permission from the local county planning bureau, and it needs to be disclosed in future real estate transactions. And those can be limitations for some people. Burial at sea and body organ and tissue donation also are described on the site. And I see that someone has just put in the comment the latest hot topic, which is natural organic reduction. That is the legal term for what many people are calling human composting, another process that has been in use for livestock for quite some time. But the company Recompose, based in Washington State, has pioneered the use for humans and legalized it first in Washington State. The Oregon legislature has just legalized this in Oregon as well, removing any legal barriers. However, any facilities that are going to offer this will have to be licensed, and that can take quite some time to come on board. They'll need to develop a business plan and a business model. It may be that Recompose, that has opened the facility in Seattle, will be seeking to open one in the Oregon market. If this interests you, you can go to the website that Leanne has posted in the chat and sign up to follow their news. And you can choose to have your body, a loved one's body, taken up to Seattle. You can do the transportation yourself or work with them to have a funeral home transport the body, and the natural organic reduction can happen out of state for deaths that happen in Oregon. That results in, as Leanne has said, it hastens the process that happens naturally in the ground, shortens the time period, and instead of having powdered bone fragments that aren't necessarily good to garden with and actually can be harmful to some plants, it is soil. And so there are different options then for what one might choose to do with that. So as you can see, there are new technologies and processes and products that are developing all of the time. Let's go to the next slide. Again, just to highlight that, I see from Suzanne, she's asked a question about whether a veteran's burial can be green. And actually, this is new, again, illustrating that things change all the time. The National Veterans Cemetery, Willamette Cemetery in Portland, I have just been told, will now accommodate a green or natural burial. So this is a good illustration of consumer demand and not taking the way things are as the way things may always need to be if questions are asked and people push for what they'd like to see available. So in terms of that period of time between death and when final disposition occurs, even in cases where autopsy has been performed or a death investigation or where organ or tissue donation has been facilitated, it is possible to work with the coroner or those supporting the donation to enable the body to be viewed, to be cared for final disposition or transportation to be handled by the family or others acting as unpaid funeral service practitioners. But it does require, again, some creative problem solving and brainstorming because they are really used to funeral directors handling that behind the scenes. Kelia mentioned the misunderstanding about what's often called a 24-hour rule, which may be asserted in terms of the length of time that you might have, in a particular facility, and they have the rights to control that. But there is often the misinformation shared that a body must be refrigerated or cooled within a certain period of time. That is the case for commercial funeral providers and for institutional settings. But as Kelia said, there is no imposition of a time restriction or the necessity of cooling a body. It may be a practical matter to slow decomposition. And we, as Kelia said, have provided all the information that you need and links even to instructional videos for how you can cool a body and handle bathing, dressing, and casketing and moving the body safely. Let's go to the next slide. And as Kelia has mentioned, transportation is something that families can choose to handle. I want to clarify that the transportation permit is only required transporting to the place of final disposition. It is not required to move the body, for example, from if there was a death in a hospital or a facility to move the body to a home or to a place of worship. If you think about it, the funeral home removal service doesn't have a transportation permit with them when they are, as they say, taking the body into custody to bring it to the funeral home. It's only after that point that the death certificate and transportation permit and so forth are obtained. So there is a misunderstanding with some hospital body release policies that they won't release a body to a family without a transportation permit, but there is not a transportation permit in place when they're releasing the body to the removal services that they that come in, on behalf of funeral homes day in and day out. So again, we have a lot of stories that illustrate how families have benefited from getting involved in transportation themselves and all the different things that can look like. On the next slide, you'll just see a reference to the vast amount of material on the website that covers ceremony along the whole continuum of time, including what is often called a living funeral. We have one story example of a farewell ceremony that was held before the time of death. We also have practical tips for how to think about doing obituaries and death notices without paying newspaper advertising rates, and just a great range of examples about ceremony and ritual resources. Go to the next slide. As Kelia said, there's also a lot of content about going out greener, not only in terms of final disposition, but also any products or services. And it is a federal consumer protection law, the federal funeral rule that ensures that cemeteries and funeral homes cannot require that you buy their product. You can make, you can purchase, you can contract with somebody to fabricate for you the goods and materials that you would like. Now, a cemetery or a funeral home or a crematorium may have specific regulations about what can go into their cremation furnace, about what can go into their ground. And if those don't line up with what you have in mind, you might explore whether there's another cemetery or cremation provider that you could work with that is more aligned with what you have in mind in terms of those burial products. Let's go to the next slide. So we've mentioned a lot of different terms of different kinds of professionals, from the medical authorities to what do cemetery staff do versus what do funeral directors do? What's the difference between a funeral director and a mortician? Nothing. So again, I want to refer you to the glossary of terms that we have. But more importantly, our how-to section covers how to work with professionals if you're unfamiliar, because again, the conventional reliance on a funeral director will mean that they will facilitate getting the signature on the death certificate from the medical authority. That happens electronically in their world, that they might make the arrangements to purchase for your purchase of a headstone or to coordinate the burial with the cemetery staff. And so if you're going to handle some aspects or all aspects on your own, you really will need to have a firm understanding of what each of these different kinds of professionals do. So we not only have kind of tips and questions that you might ask of each of these professionals with a description of what they do, but we also have one-page handouts that you can print out and give to them, whether it's a 911 responder, whether it's the county registrar that you want to bring and file the report of death with. They may well not be familiar with families handling aspects of after-death care themselves. And this provides them with vetted information with all the legal citations that Kelia referred to hand to them. Some people are curious about this new category of a helping professional called end-of-life doula or death midwife or home funeral guide. And some of these folks are community educators who are dedicated to helping to restore these capacities and this knowledge and information at the family and community level. Others can be hired to actually do what families may feel that they can't do on their own. I can pretty much guarantee that almost everybody using one of these terms means something different than what the next person that you might ask. There are standards of practice that are being developed that you can find on the internet, and we link to some of the national associations. Some focus on spiritual readiness, unfinished emotional tasks, others on practicalities, some complement what hospice does. And so if you think you might want more assistance from a community-based practitioner, you can start to become acquainted with who has those skills and information base. There was a question submitted in advance about where might you purchase a headstone in Corvallis, and we don't have specific referrals to those who make product, but this is an example of where you would first want to start with a cemetery that you're planning to install the headstone and find out what parameters and requirements they have. And then once you understand the requirements from their end, you might contract with a carver, with a stonemason, with a monument company. You can find out from the cemetery who often is used by the clientele there at the cemetery. But you might also find your own artisan. But the bottom line is, what is that cemetery going to allow? So those are the kinds of things you can find under working with professionals. See, we're headed towards the end of our time. So I want to go to the next slide. And just underscore again that even after this very brief presentation, if you were brand new to this topic, you may well end up knowing more about it than many of the helping professionals that you come into contact with, as is attested to by one of the medical professionals who vetted this site, who said, and she was a nurse faculty member as well, after 33 years, she could say that she actually was unfamiliar with family rights after death occurs. And as a result, if we can go to the next slide, there are a lot of built-in barriers in terms of hospital release policies and the information that is shared with death care by death care professionals. And so we really want to commend Lumina. We had the opportunity to do an in-service with their staff and would be happy to do so if you were connected with any other helping agencies or community groups that would be interested in this kind of presentation. Although again, it's all up there on the site as well. But it can be as simple in terms of friends and family, or if you're in a helping profession, instead of saying, what funeral home are you planning to use? What funeral home can we call for you? Asking, how can we assist you with your funeral plans? Or do you have any thoughts or plans regarding after death care for your loved one? And that just opens it up a little bit. If we go to the next slide, you can see that after Kelia's experience with St. Charles and the development of this website and her persistent advocacy through the chaplain and those that had made the errors with her family's situation, that she got them to update their body release policy, very simple, one page. Previously, they had been under the impression, or their practice was only to release to a funeral home. And the state medical examiner updated their training and pledged that that would be part of the annual training to all the county level medical examiners. And on the next slide, please, you can see examples of two, one a major hospital, both hospitals, one in the Portland area and St. Charles, that had typically, again, simply handed out a list of all the local funeral homes. Ethically, they can't recommend a particular one, but now they have updated this for other after death resources to include this website so that families do realize that they can access information and resources in addition to funeral homes if they choose to do that. So next slide, please. I just want to underscore that really the value and the opportunity and a whole range of what this can look like is best told through the stories. And so you've heard Max's story, and we're joined today by Lina in Corvallis, who has beautifully told the story of her daughter, Vera Luna, who is buried on their home property. And I encourage you, if you spend time doing nothing else on this website, to take a look at those. Next slide, please. Given that we are still in the midst of a pandemic, we're coming out of it, but over the last year and a half, we devoted considerable resources to adapting all the information on the site and everything that you've heard to a pandemic-informed circumstance. So we have FAQs about doing DIY death care in a COVID-19 or other infectious environment, as well as practical guidelines, ceremony resources for mourning together when you're physically apart, as well as a whole bunch of articles about the impact of COVID-19 on death care. Next slide. Lastly, we want to share the good news that we have just in the last couple of weeks launched a companion site for Washington State. And these are both based on the model that Lee Webster developed for New Hampshire. So we've got 3 out of 50 states on the map now with this model of non-commercial public information website. It is specific to all of the rules and regulations in Washington State. And just the development of the site enabled us to bust through a barrier. Washington had sort of relapsed to 100% electronic death registration, which enabled, which disempowered any family that wanted to exercise their legal right under Washington law to handle their own paperwork. And so with this site on the horizon, the Washington State Department of Vital Statistics restored a pathway for Washington families to access paper death certificates. So that shows the power, again, of community demand, community interest, and realizing that you might explore pathways that seem to be closed off, but that could bring benefits. So we hope you'll share this with friends and family and any helping professionals in Washington. We'll go to the next slide for a few comments from Kelia, and then we'll take a few questions. Kelia? If we can hear you. Oh my gosh, we can't hear you. I'm so sorry, Kelia. Kelia, maybe you want to type in the chat if you're up for it, but we had the benefit of having a almost 50-year veteran of funeral service in Oregon. Oops, excuse me. I was just trying to say, Kelia, maybe you can type in the chat if you'd like to make any closing comments. And we'll leave you with words from one of the other experts who vetted the site, 5 decades as a funeral director and cemetery owner, who called this site a real blessing, because, you know, so many people have really been disconnected now from this aspect of what it means to be human with each other. So it's lovely seeing a few comments come in over the chat. Again, we want to encourage you to be in touch through the contact form of the website if you would like. But Holly from Lumina, are there any questions that you would want to pose to us? I tried to answer the ones that you shared with us that had come in advance.
Yeah, thank you. I just had one question. So you mentioned there's 3 states now that have a similar model. So if we do have a couple folks joining us from other states, where could they go to learn about some of these rights and resources in their states?
The National Home Funeral Alliance, and maybe somebody can pop that into the chat, has a state-by-state synopsis of the rules and regulations in each state. And the Funeral Consumer Alliance also is very supportive of funeral consumer direction. There is a book called Final Rights, RIGHTS, that has a state-by-state guide. It's about 10 years old now. I believe there is an effort to update that in the works. But that National Home Funeral Alliance can also get you to practitioners in each state. As Kelia said, it's how she found me, many of whom are dedicated to the same community admission, some of whom are on the call today as well. Other questions or comments in the last couple minutes? I thank you to Lon for noting that A Path Home is an amazing podcast that is produced by leadership in the National Home Funeral Alliance. You can look for A Path Home on podcast platforms, but you should also be able to find it from the National Home Funeral Alliance. And it is the oral storytelling version of the kinds of things that that we've just shown you pictures of on the Oregon and the Washington sites. Sandy's asked, what's the 3rd state that allows home funerals? Actually, almost every state allows home funerals or some aspects of it. There are just 1 or 2, for example, Connecticut, where my mother lives, that does require the hiring of a funeral director. The 3 states that I mentioned are 3 states that have this model of website that have been developed as a non-commercial public information website. That's New Hampshire was the original one. We based Oregon and updated kind of the model from New Hampshire and now have done Washington. There are other states, for example, there's a wonderful website in Arizona that are put together by a network of practitioners where you can learn about the services that you can hire them from. We decided not to go that route for the Oregon website because we do believe that this is also about empowering and equipping families and communities to hire no one and do it on their own. But for those that do want to hire somebody, then they can find the directories of providers that may be able to complement what they may or may not be able to do themselves. So yeah, National Home Funeral Alliance, Funeral Consumers Alliance.
Great, and we'll be sure to share some of these afterwards. Everybody that has registered will get an email afterwards with the presentation, and we'll be sure to include the link to the website and some of these other links that we've put in the chat. Terrific. So we are at our time. So thank you so much to Holly and Kelia. This has been a very interesting and informative seminar. I hope you all feel the same way. So like I said, keep an eye out for that email later this afternoon. It'll also mention our next Illuminating series for next month. Tuesday, July 20th, we'll be discussing laughter, yoga, and meditation. So stay tuned for the link to register for that. And we'll leave the slide up here. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics for the Illuminating series, feel free to reach out to us with the contact information that's on the screen. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much.